was definitely one of those courageous men, and that courage was born out in just incredible ways during that year in which he experienced almost 10 years ago. All these bad things happening to him. And so, the story, we're talking about the big story here, and God promises a lot. He says He loves us. He made us. It seems like He wants us. We say Jesus, He sent His Son to die for us so that we can have this relationship with Him. And yet when life comes hammering home, it seems like the promises are far away from the provision that God also promises to give to us. What do we do in those times? Sometimes bad things happen to us. Like Warren and Kathy had this trauma with his dad. They had trauma of heart surgery for little Jeremiah, and dealing with all that means. Sometimes things happen to us, but what if God asks us to do something that seems bizarre? In either case, it seems like we're out of joint. It seems like the story we're living is not congruent with the story God is promising to give to us. So what do we do in those cases? We're going to look at this issue, this problem, in Genesis chapter 22. And it's a story about Abraham being asked by God to kill his son. Now that's about as bizarre as it gets. In fact, as you're finding that, I want to read something that Mark Driscoll wrote as a new Christian. Mark Driscoll, the pastor of a church in Seattle, a large, humongous church. He's a young guy. He said, I came to Christ at the age of 19. And he said, I'm going to just start reading the Bible. So he said, I expected to find examples of godly men and women that would show me how to live a godly life. He said, this is what actually happened. He said, I started reading, and what I read in Genesis actually shocked me. The book seemed to be mainly about the story of one family that descended from a man named Abraham. While God clearly loved and blessed his family, it was far more like an episode of Jerry Springer than I was expecting. Abraham had both a young wife and an old wife. Their grandson Jacob was clearly a con man and ended up marrying two sisters. The great Noah got drunk and passed out naked in his tent like some redneck on vacation. Some guy named Lot also got drunk. After Genesis, I continued reading the Old Testament only to find that Moses was known to disobey and argue with God. David was an adulterer and murderer. Solomon had so many women living with him that even Hugh Hefner would have blushed. And other than the occasional person like Joseph, Daniel, or Boaz, most everyone that I had ever heard about in the Old Testament was as messed up as anyone I had ever met. So if you're new to the Bible, that's what you discover. These bizarre stories. And this story we read about this morning really takes the cake. Because it just seems to show a God who is out of control. A God who is untrustworthy. But we're going to explain this story and figure it out here in the next few minutes. So let's read what happens. Genesis 22. In Genesis 12, God calls one man, this is after Noah and the Tower of Babel, God calls one man, Abraham, to build a nation. And he says, Abraham, with you, I'm going to build a nation. You and your wife Sarah, I'm going to build it through a son that you're going to have. Now, Abraham and Sarah have the son Isaac. And he is the child of the promise. It is through Isaac that God is going to build the nation. But here's what God asked Abraham to do. Genesis 22 goes like this. Sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said to him, Abraham, here am I, Abraham replied. Then God said, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about. Now listen, all of us as parents have wanted to do this, right? Deep in our hearts, we're like, show me the mountain, let's go. But that's only out of anger. That's not what's happening here. God is asking Abraham to take his only son up to a mountain, tie him down, kill him, and then burn him. That's not the God I'm kind of used to hearing about, okay? But here's verse 3. Early the next morning, Abraham got up and saddled his donkey. He took with him two of his servants and his son Isaac. When he cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. On the third day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. And he said to his servant, stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. And listen, we will worship and we will come back to you. There's a hint. Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. And as the two of them went on together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father, Father Abraham, Father? Yes, my son, Abraham replied. The fire and the wood are here. He starts to notice some things. But where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham answered, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." And the two of them went on together. When they reached the place God had told him about. Now, how many of you heard this story? You know how it ends? One thing about reading stories in the Old Testament, or stories in the Bible, is that we know how it ends. So it's easy to look back and say, "Oh, well, of course Abraham should have faith. There's going to be a ram up there, ready?" But that's not the way life is lived. Life is lived in the moment. We don't live with the end, all set for us. So Abraham is trudging up this mountain without the end. He doesn't know the end of the story. So you think about it as we read these stories, where they are. They're read it as if you're in the story, not knowing the end. So here's how it ends up. When they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there, and he arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham." "Here I am," he replied. "Do not lay a hand on the boy. Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your only son, your only son." Abraham looked up, and there in a thicket he saw a ram caught by the horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place Jehovah-Jireh, the Lord will provide. And to this day it is said, "On the mountain of the Lord it will be provided." Now that's a weird story. Reading that through 21st century eyes, you're going, what kind of God is this who's going to ask, his main dude, his main character, to go take his only son, the child of promise, and lay him out, kill him, and then burn him? And you kind of understand why some people in our culture have issues with, the Bible. It's not an easy book to understand. But we are convinced that there is a story. There's a storyline here that is consistent throughout the Bible, and there are themes in this story that help us deal with life. So how does this story fit in? Well, let's go back to the very beginning. We know that we are the only creation, right, that is made to receive God's love, to know it comes from Him, and to be able to respond back to Him in love. Nothing else can do that. I love dogs. I love cats. I love these things. But they do not have the capacity that we have to receive God's love, to know it came from Him, and to respond back in love.